Hello everyone, my name is Bich-Hang Duong, a researcher at the University of Minnesota. Today, on behalf of the RISE Vietnam Country Research Team, I'm presenting our research entitled Inequalities in Learning in Vietnam, Teachers' Beliefs About and Classroom Practices for Ethnic Minorities. And these are the parts that I will go through in this presentation: context of the research questions, conceptual framework, methodology, findings, and discussion. And then finally, I will talk a little bit about the implication for policy and practice. As some of you may already know, Vietnam often has been characterized as having overall high learning outcomes as measured on national or international tests like the PISA test of the OECD. And analysis of PISA data shows that Vietnam has better equity in learning outcomes than many other systems, in which students from the poorest quintile outperforms students from the wealthiest quintiles in other countries. But in reality, the system is faced with hidden inequalities in learning. The literature suggests that the overall gross enrollment rates in Vietnam are increasing, but higher levels of education see considerably lower rates of enrollment for ethnic minorities students. For example, Young Life's longitudinal studies showed that while there are overall improvements in learning outcomes, ethnic minorities students tended to have lower levels of prior learning. Our own RISE secondary data also shows there are considerable learning outcomes gaps between ethnic minority and King majority students. And these charts illustrate the overall mean differences between the two 7th grade groups in test scores of two subjects, maths and literature. And these ones show learning progress distribution of the two groups. Even among the ethnic minorities, we can see the gaps in both the academic outcomes and learning progress. For example, data on learning progress in the right of this slide illustrates gain by main ethnic groups. It reveals that some groups gained considerably more than others, for example, Muong in literature, or more clearly Khmer in both math and literature. Meanwhile, some other groups have little to negative changes. So now I would like to present some more information about the Vietnamese society and the education system. Vietnam has a diverse population. The majority of it is King and only 14% is ethnic minorities. The history of the state and governance in Vietnam is to assimilate ethnic minorities and put down any resistance to the state. Many poverty reduction programs have been implemented to improve the people's living standards, but also to change ethnic practices. Politically, schooling in Vietnam is used to support nationalist objectives and discourses of integration and assimilation of all groups within a socialist society. And the state uses some mechanisms for political integration. For example, all schools in Vietnam use a single and unified curriculum, and King language, known as Vietnamese, is adopted as the national language. And finally, as you may know, the social sciences education curriculum, for example, history and civics education, is used to impart principles of unity, nationalism, and assimilation rather than endorsing diverse identities. But in reality, schooling is not regarded as producing upward mobility as designed by the government and by ethnic minority families themselves. This is because many minorities are unable to find work in a changing economy. Research studies also show how the ideas of backwardness and poverty have long been associated within ethnic minorities in state policies and in public discourse. So it is important to study how teachers' beliefs and practices reflect and are shaped by these dominant beliefs, and how schools reproduce structural inequalities between the majority king and minorities in Vietnam. In this research, we seek to answer three questions. Number one, how do teachers perceive the learning abilities of ethnic minority students as compared to king students? And do they have different expectations for king and non-king students? And second, how do teachers' beliefs affect their teaching? And finally, what does teachers' differing pedagogic work reveal about inequalities in learning and in society in general? In this study, we draw on the socially inclusive pedagogy framework that Gale, Mills, and Cross put forward. There are three principles in this framework. Number one is beliefs. They are principles of good teaching that ensures equity among groups, and they inform pedagogic design and actions. Number two is design. These include strategies to develop hegemonic knowledge and skills and also mitigate effects of hegemonic curriculum. And the last one is pedagogic practices or actions. They are tactics to work with students and engage them in making sense of the world. So the key point about this framework is that pedagogy is regarded as the first and most strategic place to resolve disadvantaged problems and achieve social justice. As such, teachers and teacher educators should draw on these principles to create opportunities for all students to fully engage in the learning process. This study regards teaching as a complex and interactive social control practice. So, to capture this complexity, we used multiple methods: video observations of teachers and students, document collection of teacher lesson plans, student work and assessments, and also teacher and principal interviews. And for this paper, we analyzed 68 teacher interviews, both before and after video recordings, and observation from schools that had mostly ethnic minority classrooms, and then compared themes from their interviews or videos with teachers who taught mostly king students. And here is the map of the locations that we collected data for this study. We performed data analysis with the assistance of Transana, a qualitative data analysis software that is inductive coding, which was cross-checked by team members and then confirmed by a project leader. It is important to note that we are not interested in quantitative classroom observations. Of course, we do consider the frequencies of patterns of the themes, but the focus is more on analyzing teachers' assumptions and beliefs about teaching from their interviews alongside what and how they teach in the classroom, and also how students respond to their teaching. So it is not a simple categorization of teachers' practices or interactions with students, but what they are doing in relation to what they know about teaching and the content, and what they plan to do and why they are doing that. So now I will present findings according to the three components suggested by Gale's framework to illustrate the extent and the ways teachers' pedagogic work is organized in a socially inclusive manner. The first finding is about teachers' beliefs. We found that a majority of teachers teaching ethnic minority students had low expectation of them. The teacher engaged in pedagogic practices that clearly assumed that ethnic minority are not as capable and competent as King students in learning. And teacher believes that students simply can't achieve high levels of learning and that they aren't able to think critically or creatively, often mostly because they are not as proficient or adept with Vietnamese language. So as you see from this slide, some examples of quotes from the teachers we interviewed. They don't know, poor cognitive ability, low level of thinking, and slow in studying and acquiring knowledge were common words used by teachers when they refer to learning ability of ethnic minorities students. In terms of curricular design, our analysis reveals that teachers designed the lessons in ways that taught dominant knowledge and skills such as King language and nationalist topics in the curriculum rather than local ethnic lives. Teachers also remarked that ethnic minority students are quiet and shy, but they did not give these students chances to speak freely without corrections or to share ideas beyond an expected answer. So it is evident from class video and teacher interview data that teachers showed a disregard for students' local and cultural knowledge and language. So in other words, teacher rarely offered a counter-hegemonic approach that mitigates these empowering effects of the King language curriculum, and this further marginalized ethnic minorities students from learning in the classroom. The third aspect of socially inclusive pedagogy we focused on is teachers' teaching practices or actions. The findings show that teachers use didactic instruction in a way that primarily aimed to clarify terms and improve pronunciation. These approaches are useful for learning the foundations of language, but if only focused on correcting pronunciation and giving little chance to solidify their learning and teach higher order thinking skills, these practices tend to position students as subjects of teaching, or what Paulo Freire, in describing the banking approach to teaching, referred to as anti-versals. In this sense, the students are supposed to be filmed up and enlightened rather than actors of learning who are expected to bring knowledge to the learning environment. So by speaking at students, asking simple questions, or attempting to transmit mere knowledge rather than developing necessary competencies, teachers tended to act on students rather than working with them to engage them in exploring and understanding the world. And here are some examples from teacher interviews. We also have much evidence from recorded class observations that show teachers' differential practices toward ethnic minority and King students. So for the discussion of the findings, I would like to focus on three key points. First, this research overall shows that teachers' use of the curriculum and their pedagogical actions in the classrooms were found to be far from socially inclusive. Although a small number of teachers in our study appreciated ethnic minorities' cultures and held high expectations toward both King and non-King students, most teacher participants were not able to enact an appropriate pedagogy that would build on both dominant knowledge and non-dominant knowledge. These studies findings echo other research, indicating the strict adherence of many Vietnamese schools and teachers to the one-size-fits-all curriculum and textbooks. Second, from a critical perspective, we argue that teachers' discriminatory beliefs are greatly shaped by social norms and structures, ones that sustain the deficit discourse, whereby people from disadvantaged groups are considered in terms of deficits rather than assets. Studies have indicated that this adverse discourse is deeply anchored within schools, in teacher education programs, and in the larger Vietnamese society, where social hierarchies dominate almost all social relations, and a lack of appreciation for diversity and pluralism is manifest. So in this context, schools operate to maintain social order through the sustenance of a class system rather than promoting class mobility and equity. Accordingly, non-dominant groups continue to be minoritized, and inequalities between the minoritized students and the majority are further exacerbated. So as we can see, insights from this study could have important implications for Vietnamese educational practitioners where some level of change is possible. Much literature has suggested that inclusive pedagogy should begin with teacher education and teacher professional development programs. And teachers need to understand and engage in social justice, for example, through community engagement activities, and apply pedagogies for diversity, for example, by applying culturally responsive teaching or differentiated learning. What about implications for policy making? We know that for years the Vietnamese government has expressed commitment to improving ethnic minority people's lives, but addressing long-held cultural misperceptions and legitimating social differences and diversity should be priorities for policy action to tackle persistent inequalities rather than just only technical solution. It is a real challenge because Vietnam's education system is still a centralized system informed by state socialism, where national policy is often adopted with little space for challenging or resisting dominant ideologies and practices. So hopefully, through bottom-up efforts driven by educators, socially inclusive pedagogy, diverse knowledges and ways of knowing are recognized and valued. This will contribute to bridging the gaps in learning and improving equity among groups of learners. Thank you for listening. We look forward to your questions in our online discussion.